a country reunify after it's divided by a violent conflict? Will that country be the same? And how can it support and protect the rights and liberties of newly freed people who had been unjustly kept in bondage for hundreds of years?
These questions and more faced policymakers in the aftermath of the Civil War. Their success and failures at answering them still have consequences to this day. This is the story of Reconstruction.
The tensions that boiled over into the Civil War had deep roots. Regional social and economic differences derived from the institution of slavery had created a divide in the nation that resulted in war.
And this war led to significant changes, the most important of which came on September 22nd, 1862, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which formally freed the enslaved in rebel states effective January 1st, 1863, and set the nation on the road to complete abolition.
As the conflict wound down, Union policymakers needed to bring the country together, overcome the deep seated regional differences that had led to conflict, and integrate the newly freed people of the South fully into society. This process would be called Reconstruction.
The Reconstruction period can be divided into three phases. The first, from 1862 to 1865, was wartime Reconstruction. These were the early efforts taken to reconstruct the nation while the Civil War was still raging.
The second was Presidential Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1867. This phase saw President Andrew Johnson spearhead a lenient Reconstruction, frustrating the hopes of many who wanted more radical reforms.
The third and final phase was Congressional Reconstruction. This period lasted from 1867 to 1877 and saw Congress assert its authority over Johnson's objections to directly control Reconstruction.
Abraham Lincoln began to outline his ideas for reconciling the nation's differences as the war was still in its final phases. His second inaugural address promised a message of reconciliation, quote, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace.
Lincoln believed secession was illegal and that the Southern states had never left the Union. His plan for Reconstruction followed this logic. In 1863, Lincoln outlined a moderate plan for reconstructing the rebellious states with his 10% plan. This plan would grant amnesty to rebels who took a loyalty oath to the Union, with some exceptions for high-ranking Confederate leaders. Once 10% of the state's electorate had done so, the state would be welcomed back into the Union. States would also be required to abolish slavery in their new state constitution. This general plan would be adopted in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee.
Not everyone was on board with Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. He was opposed by the so-called radical Republicans, who were members of Congress that wanted to punish the South. They also believed that giving Black men the right to vote was essential for securing the civil rights of the newly freed people and the changes brought about by the Civil War.
Congress refused to recognize the states reconstructed under Lincoln's plan and instead put forward the Wade-Davis bill. This plan was rooted in the federal government's power to guarantee a Republican form of government in the states. It required a majority of white male citizens to take an oath declaring loyalty to the United States.
Lincoln, worried in part that radical plans for Reconstruction would delay the end of the war, pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. While debates over Reconstruction continued, Congress was also debating a constitutional amendment to forever end slavery in the United States. After months of debate, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution on January 31st, 1865, and sent it to the states for ratification.
Tragically, on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. This propelled Andrew Johnson into the presidency. Johnson, a Southerner and former slave owner, took an even more lenient approach than Lincoln, which also put him at odds with the radical Republicans in Congress.
Johnson took a soft stance on former Confederates, pardoning many former leaders of the rebellion. Johnson also opposed the involvement of Blacks in government and disregarded concerns of Northerners at the passage of Black codes in the South.
African Americans in the South faced tremendous challenges, even though they were legally free. These obstacles were numerous and included outbreaks of disease, meager rations of food, dislocation from their homes, and a lack of education opportunities. Many Northerners traveled south to assist with both humanitarian aid and to provide education. Congress also established the Freedmen's Bureau to assist in the humanitarian crisis in the South. As essential as this aid was, many Northern leaders knew that to ensure their security, African Americans needed to be equally protected by laws established by their own consent.
In spring 1866, Congress passed a Civil Rights Act over President Johnson's veto to protect the rights of African Americans. The bill called for every person, regardless of race, to have the same civil rights in every state. In the fall of 1866, the Republican Party won an unassailable majority in Congress and began to take Reconstruction in an even more aggressive direction. However, Johnson continued his attempts to halt Congress's Reconstruction efforts, setting up an inevitable political showdown.
To take the provisions of the Civil Rights Act further, Representative John Bingham of Ohio proposed the 14th Amendment to protect the rights of Black citizens constitutionally. The goal of the amendment was to extend citizenship to everyone born in the United States, except Indians on reservations. Despite Johnson's obstructions, the amendment passed and would eventually become one of the strongest protections of individual rights in the Constitution.
Congress also passed a series of bills known collectively as the Reconstruction Acts, which outlined a stricter process for Southern states to be welcomed back into the Union. It placed the Southern states into 5 military districts and required that each state draft a new constitution, which had to be approved by Congress. They were also required to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant voting rights to African American men. These acts were again passed despite President Johnson's veto.
Tensions between the president and Congress came to a head in 1868 when Congress claimed that Johnson's violation of the Tenure of Office Act had gone too far. The House of Representatives impeached Johnson, who came one vote short of being removed from office.
Later in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected to the presidency with the help of hundreds of thousands of Black votes. Grant supported the more aggressive Reconstruction of Congress. His presidency oversaw the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for all males regardless of race. His years in office also saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which sought to stop segregation and public accommodations.
However, the years of Grant's presidency also saw a dramatic rise in violence inflicted on African Americans. White supremacists in the South used brutality and intimidation to deny Black people their civil and political rights. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan murdered and destroyed the property of thousands of African Americans through mob violence.
To combat this surge of violence, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts and Klan Act to prosecute white supremacists who violated African Americans' rights. The government also created the Department of Justice to enforce these laws. These efforts marked an expansion of the federal government's powers in order to protect Black civil rights.
The formal period of Reconstruction came to an end in 1877 with the withdrawal of the last federal troops from the South. However, their departure unfortunately meant that the African Americans had less protections from violence and intimidation in the South. Over the next several decades, Blacks in the South lost most of what they gained during Reconstruction and were subjected to widespread violence and oppression.
So, was Reconstruction successful? What exactly did it accomplish? The debates over this topic are vast and varied. Reconstruction successfully reunited the states. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments established a constitutional framework for equality under the law and civil rights. Black land ownership increased, and the number of Black representatives increased from 0 to nearly 15% of all office holders by 1872.
However, despite these tenuous gains, the federal government failed to effectively protect the rights of African Americans in the South. Many African Americans remained stuck in perpetual debt through sharecropping and racist laws that restricted property ownership. Violence haunted the lives of African Americans in the South, and shortly after Reconstruction ended, segregationist policies and Jim Crow laws formally deprived African Americans of equality before the law and their civil rights.
The Reconstruction period saw the United States grapple with its founding ideals as it reunited in the wake of the Civil War. Questions over the nature of equality and freedom were at the heart of the most consequential debates of the period. Though some progress was made, it proved short-lived, and decades of violence and oppression would follow.
In many ways, the nation is still grappling with the events of this period. What do you think is the legacy of the Reconstruction era? This has been the story of Reconstruction. Melissa, where'd you go? Well, I guess you went to go like and subscribe.